Okay, hello everyone. My name is Kyle Yoho. I am the Education Director here at the Castle. This is our second hybrid program. We will be doing our best to provide you who are in person and those who are online with us a good experience here. So just please bear with us as we go through our second only hybrid situation here. So we will be having our presentation by Claire. And I'll go ahead and pull up her slides for her. Then she's going to come in and start talking to us. So for those of us in the audience, and we're going to hold questions to the end. Person is repeating those questions so our online people can hear. And then we are going to take questions online as well. So for those of you who are online, please use the queuing up Claire's slides for her. Okay. And for those online, if you have any technical difficulties you can't hear or having trouble seeing something, please write into the chat and you can direct those to the Castle as the panelist. Okay, thank you everyone. We'll get started now.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here in person and for tuning in online for those of you in the camera here. My name's Claire Crane, and it's my pleasure to be here tonight to tell you a little bit about the First World War from a unique perspective. We'll be joining Flora Mason, Marietta musician, on her travels through France as a wartime welfare worker with the YMCA. So first, a little bit of background on where and when we are in history. We're going back 100 years or so to 1918. The Great War has been going on for a few years and America has just joined the fray. When the American soldiers arrived in France, they might have been confronted with sights like these. So on the upper left, we've got trench warfare, soldiers hiding from machine guns and from artillery bombardments. On the upper right, we have some soldiers in gas masks because there was chemical warfare during World War I. And we also get a sense of the global scope of the war because those soldiers are colonial troops, probably from India. So we have the European opponents and then also coming into play. We have no man's land in the lower left corner, miles and miles of destroyed forests, villages, fields, maybe even flamethrowers or other new kinds of weapons that were being tried out during the First World War. So all of this considered, all of this brutality or, sort of the darker side of things, you probably don't think that the soldiers would be finding comforting cups of hot chocolate, having swims in the ocean and walking under palm trees, or enjoying donuts and cookies and sandwiches and things like that. Ski resorts, dances, casinos, baths and hot springs, tennis matches, movie nights, those things probably don't come to mind either when it comes to the First World War, but these were very much a part of the American soldiers' experience of World War I. In fact, they were deemed so essential to the military effort and morale and morality that they were arranged for by the military. So the Army made sure that soldiers could have comforting cups of chocolate and donuts. So sometimes, despite the seemingly vast difference between these images and these, they were very close together during the First World War. So for those of you online and in person, all of the video clips that I'm going to be showing tonight are silent, so there's no technical difficulty. They're period pieces of film. So you can see in this video, which is one of my favorites of YMCA work during the First World War, that we have some women in helmets standing by some camouflaged equipment, and they are dishing out hot chocolate to soldiers as they get ready to go to the trenches. So there we are. There's some artillery shelling in the background, big old tubs or gallons of hot chocolate that they're dishing out as the soldiers get ready to move forward in the front. So, pretty close for comfort there. So what are these ladies doing so close to the front, so close to the danger during the First World War 100 years ago? So to get a little bit more information on that, why they're there. See, so during the First World War, service organizations like the YMCA conducted welfare work at home and abroad. So welfare work was to support the mental, emotional, and physical well-being of the soldiers. So according to William Taft's 1922 book, Service with Fighting Men, the American Young Men's Christian Association, or YMCA, in its welfare work served between 4 and 5 millions of American soldiers and sailors at home and overseas. As General Pershing has said, it conducted 9/10 of the welfare work among the American forces in Europe. The military asked the YMCA to take over the canteen service. And so wherever the soldiers went in France, the YMCA went. So they would set up huts or canteens where they would sell American goods like Lucky Strike cigarettes and Hershey's bars. They would send entertainers to camps and they would host dances. They would fry up donuts. So they would offer these kinds of wholesome entertainment for the soldiers too. It was meant to keep the boys out of trouble, out of the bars and brothels where they might get themselves into trouble and out of fighting fitness. So the Y ran these kinds of comforts close to the front or in camps. They also ran leave areas. So when soldiers had a week furlough or time off, they couldn't go home because that was an ocean away. So they needed somewhere to go on those leaves. So they would go to some French resort towns that the YMCA took over. And this is where we'll see Flora Mason at work because she worked at those leave areas. So to get a little bit more Marietta specific, Marietta had several YMCA volunteers, and there were probably more than this, but these were the volunteers that I was able to tie back to Marietta using the University of Minnesota's really large collection of these indexed service cards. So from those records, we know that Glenn Morton Colby served soldiers stateside in training camps, Camp Taylor and Camp Hancock, and he was the physical director. So that meant that he ran athletics. So he would do baseball and football games, boxing matches, tug of war competitions, things like that. We had Mordaunt Dove Coons, who was sent overseas to work with soldiers in France. We had Archer Butler Holbert, who graduated from Marietta College and taught there, and he traveled stateside to give educational lectures, and the YMCA did give educational classes for soldiers at home and abroad, so on things like art, architecture, reading and writing, to give them tools they needed to succeed after the war. And then we also had Herman Addison Moore, who worked at Camp Sherman, stateside here in Ohio, and Edward Smith Parsons, who became the president of Marietta College right after the war in 1919. He was on the YMCA War Work Council, so he determined where volunteers would go. So should they stay stateside or should they go abroad and work with soldiers in France? He might have determined that Flora Mason, whose index card is on this slide, should go overseas and work with the soldiers in France. So from just this record of Flora's service, we can see in the upper left-hand corner that she was born in 79. So 1879, she was around 38 years old when she entered the war effort. She lived on 2nd Street in Marietta. And she arrived in France in August 1918 and retired or returned back to the US in July of 1919. So she spent almost a year overseas in the First World War. On the bottom, they have different characteristics of the volunteers, different skills that they were bringing in. So we know from these sort of hash marks that she knew German, she was Baptist, so we have that religious affiliation with the Young Men's Christian Association. She could work as a purchasing agent, so she could run the business end of things overseas because canteens were run like businesses, and that she also had some college education. I'm not sure why they say college partial, because we'll find out on the next slide that she did graduate from college. You can also see that she's single, but that the record was updated to married. We see that her name was Flora Mason, but then it's Mrs. James Jr. Hamilton, and we'll learn more about that later too. So you might also see that her occupation is listed as secretary. And that is just a gender neutral term for the YMCA volunteer at that time. So it doesn't mean office work or administrative work. It means that she was one of the volunteers on the ground level that was working with soldiers. So as we know from her card, she's college educated. So she graduated from Marietta College in 1901. This is a clipping from the Marietta Daily Leader, June 13th, 1901, and she's circled in the blue in this graduating class. We know that she graduated magna cum laude, and that her department honors included political science, German, English literature, and she's a woman after my own heart because those were my undergrad majors. Yes, liberal arts. So one thing to note is that while Flora received honors in history and political science, she wouldn't have been able to vote at this time. So even though she knew more than a lot of men probably about politics and the historical context of the day, she wouldn't have been able to vote until after story with the passing of the 19th Amendment. The paper notes that Miss Mason in choicest class lab comes to marrying exercises. So she was clearly already a leader. You know, it's just her college days. She's taking the stage and leading the charge. So these are qualities that she'll continue to show later on. We'll see Flora's name published again a couple years after that. This time in the record of the Nye family reunion that took place in Marietta in August 1905, and it is an event. Among those who heard her play were probably residents of the castle, so that's where we're having this talk for those online. And so in the list of those Nye family members who were in attendance, they mention Lucy Nye Davis, Theodore Davis, Grace Davis, and Mrs. J.N.D. Lindsay, or Jessie Davis Lindsay. So they would have been familiar with Flora Mason as an organist at that time. She comes up again in publication, so following the paper trail, a couple years after that in December 1912, and she is a member of the American Guild of Organists. So we know that after her college days, she took on a musical career, and that will also play a part in her board work. So we've hit the 1910s. In 1917, America enters the Great War, and in 1918, Flora would too. I chose this newspaper clipping because I like that it underscores that women had a part to play in the war as well. So it says, "Now that war is here, what is my share? Some answers to the question now uppermost in the mind of every citizen. What shall young and old, rich and poor, men and women do for the cause of our nation?" So So perhaps Flora might have seen a brochure like this one, advertising women's overseas service with the YMCA. This is available online through the Smithsonian, just to give credit where credit is due. So at 38 years old and single, Flora would have been an ideal candidate. Female volunteers needed to be at least 5 years old of their moms, their aunts, their sisters, maybe their sweethearts, but the Y didn't want the volunteers to become the sweethearts of the soldiers. Some married women volunteered with the Y, but ideally they were without dependents or without relatives who were working already in the war effort. So being unattached at this time is ideal for a volunteer. They were also looking for college alumni. So someone with that background could probably connect with men from a lot of different backgrounds and might be ready to take on the task of running the business that a self-sustaining canteen was supposed to be. The YMCA was also looking for musicians. Again, they could entertain the men by playing guitar or piano, maybe leading a sing-along, something like that. So Flora would have been an ideal candidate. To give you a sense of what Flora was signing up for, I want to read an excerpt from this brochure. I can't help myself because it captures the scope of the work very well. And even if she didn't see this brochure in particular, she probably would have gotten this information through the application and interview process. But the brochure reads, "The work in the canteens is of a varied and often trying and difficult nature, and no woman should consider it unless she is willing and able to endure the loneliness and hardships that life in an isolated French village may mean. The YMCA work is on a semi-military basis. Like a good soldier, every worker must be prepared to obey orders and go wherever she is sent. She must be ready to labor with her hands, to scrub floors and wash dishes, with the same enthusiasm that she greets the men or plans an entertainment. While it is the constant duty of the women to transform bleak, muddy huts into popular and attractive gathering places, and to prepare and serve hot coffee, chocolate, soups, sandwiches, donuts, and pies, the great purpose is to bring cheer and comfort into our distant camps and to create there the spirit and atmosphere and influence of the American home." So even with that description of the hardships and challenges, Flora charged ahead. She forged ahead, and we have another paper trail of her applying for her passport to go overseas. We also get an updated picture of Flora. So we last saw her in her college days. Here she is at 38, ready to go overseas to work in the war effort. So these records are available through Family Search, even though it's usually for genealogy purposes. You can also find other folks. So I was able to find some things about Flora. On the left, you can see her application to go to France and Great Britain, because they weren't sure where exactly you might wind up, where you would be ordered to go. And it's for YMCA canteen work. In the middle page, we get a little more information about Flora's appearance up top. So we know that she has hazel eyes, dark brown hair, and she's 5'5", so just an inch taller than me. And in the middle of the page, we get a sense of her timeline in 1918. So she was 2nd Street, Marietta, but then in June of that year, she traveled to New York, probably for the interview process, and then to get her uniform and ship out on a ship to France. So as a note, volunteers also often paid their own way to New York, so they kind of had to put their money where their mouth is before that interview. Lastly, on the letter to the right, we have official confirmation from the War Work Council that Flora is indeed headed to France for service with the troops of the American Expeditionary Force in France. So she is on her way, and here she is in her uniform. Let me see if I can get this, maybe. Yeah, here we go. So we see Flora Mason in her uniform, and to give the color of that uniform, you can see on this fundraising poster that it's a gray uniform, spots of horizon blue, as they called it, and then the red triangle, which was the symbol for the Y during the First World War. So also something to note about the poster, it mentions one of the 1,000 YMCA girls in France. And at this time, around November 1918, there would have been around 1,000. But by the end of the war, in terms of women working overseas with service organizations, there were around 3,500 women overseas. Unfortunately, Flora didn't leave us a journal or a collection of letters or a memoir to let us know what she was thinking and feeling during her work overseas. But we do know where she worked and generally doing what, because she donated her uniform to the Ohio History Connection with this picture. So the biographical note, which kind of sounds like she wrote it herself, mentions a few specific leave areas that she worked in during the war, and we're going to visit those places through the accounts of soldiers on leave who might have encountered her there, and other volunteers working with the Y. So we'll still get to know what she was up to when she arrived in France. Great. So before we dive into the specifics of which leave areas she worked at, I want to acknowledge that working a military leave area was no small task. They wanted it to be all fun and games for the soldiers, but it wasn't fun and games getting it all put together. So the previous description that I gave from the brochure was of canteen work, which was more close to the front or at training camps. But leave areas were usually popular resort towns that were repurposed during the war to be for American soldiers to take a break. So in her 1920 book on YMCA work, Catherine Mayo notes that between December 1918 and April 1919, 325,850 soldiers visited leave areas. And Letty Gavin notes that as an example, one leave area might have 4,000 soldiers at a time, 600 new arrivals and departures every day in a constant cycle. So no small task to make a personal connection with all of these soldiers and try to make sure that they have a good time before they're back to the front again. Kara Dixon Buick summarizes an average day for a YMCA worker at a leave area by talking about Marian Baldwin's experience. And her typical day was a 13-hour day. So to describe it, 1.5 hours selling goods at the canteen counter and making conversation with all the soldiers. And then 2 hours playing tennis with soldiers because they would be dated up with different soldiers to spend some particular time with them. Then it was 3 hours at the canteen after a quick lunch. Then 2 hours showing soldiers the facilities and activities and sites that they might check out in their time at the leave area. And then, lest you think she could get off her feet at 7 p.m., she's on duty to dance from 7 p.m. to 11:30 p.m. So she'd probably also have many different dance partners per dance, a lot of cutting in, because if we take as average 4,000 soldiers at a leave area at a time, there might be 40 women. So that's a lot of partners. And just to give a little demonstration of that, the National Archives has a couple clips of leave activities in 1919. And so look at all of the soldiers watching, maybe waiting for a dance. So we have these couples here, and then off to some other entertainment, so some bike rides. But busy days for the leave area YMCA workers. So Flora Mason would have been busy, for hours and hours on end on her feet. All right, so, oops. We already saw the dance. So, all right, so to get particular about the leave areas that she worked at, I will apologize in advance. I, like Flora, learned German, so I did look up the French pronunciations of these towns. I'll do my best. But Flora Mason worked at the mountain resort town of La Bourboulée, and we see a postcard of this scenic spot. There were casinos there, hot springs, things like that the soldiers could enjoy. And from the register, which is like a document that was, or a book that soldiers could sign in and out from, let their friends know that they stayed here. We have a soldier saying, "What expresses the joys of a week at La Bourboulée better than from cooties to feather beds in 76 hours?" So, as Everett W. Dewey mentions here, how wonderful it would be to go to a place where you have a real bed with soft pillows, clean sheets, perhaps a room to yourself or just a friend or two, versus trying to catch some shut-eye in the trenches next to the muddy sandbags with other soldiers walking to and fro, maybe hearing some gunshots or some artillery fire up in the background. So quite a juxtaposition, quite a contrast, and quite a relief probably for the soldiers that they could go from cooties to feather beds, from cooties, which would be those lights in the trenches and all the pests, to a very clean place where they could get their clothes clean, they could take a dip in a hot spring. We have another soldier writing at La Bourboulée after Christmas, and he says, "There's one old gentleman who talks to me like dad, and a girl to sing to me like sister, and a girl to dance like my angel, and all of them make me want to love mother and sister more." The YMCA was supposed to be home away from home for the soldiers, and to remind the boys of their families and friends at home who are thinking of them. You can see in this excerpt too that women played a lot of different conventional feminine roles in this very unconventional space in a war-torn country. There were mothers soldiers' corners. So that would be like the picture here, where boys could get patches or buttons sewn back onto their uniforms. I've heard of stories where soldiers like intentionally ripped off buttons so that they had an excuse to go talk to mom in mother's corners. And there were younger volunteers who would sing, dance, keep things lively. They were, as YMCA volunteer Merry Early Holiday representatives of American womanhood in its many forms at this time. So we have La Bourboulée, and close by Mont d'Or was another town where soldiers could stay. They were very close together. So in this clipping from the Stars and Stripes, a Soldiers magazine, or a Soldiers newspaper, you can see that they're advertising a new leave area in readiness. Hot springs await Yanks at La Bourboulée and Mont d'Or. So at this particular place, another register was there for soldiers to sign in and out of. And this soldier writes, "I take my hat off to the Y girls of Mont d'Or. If I was the commander-in-chief of the AEF, or American Expeditionary Force, instead of a sergeant in the artillery, I would make awards of Distinguished Service Crosses, DCSs or DSCs, to the women who have made a spot in France feel like America for a few days. At Mont d'Or, we are lifted out of the atmosphere of the battleground. It has done us a world of good." So we return to that contrast, that juxtaposition from the beginning of this talk, from cooties to feathers beds, that we have this brutality of the battle, but then we have this escape to home away from home where we can rest, recharge, remember what we're fighting for, remember what we're fighting to return to. So back at home. As just a fun side note, while that sergeant in the artillery couldn't award the YMCA women Distinguished Service Crosses, YMCA volunteers did get awarded YMCA, or did get awarded Distinguished Service Crosses, and no women, 6 YMCA men did, but over 10 women were awarded the Croix de Guerre. And so in this picture, we have 3 YMCA volunteers getting pinned with that medal. So the YMCA volunteers did get medals, distinctions, honors, citations, because they oftentimes did get close to the front and experience the chemical warfare and the shell shock that soldiers would have to. So wherever they went, wherever the soldiers went, the YMCA tried to go as well. All right, so I also wanted to mention that the rave reviews that we saw from the registers weren't always the case. I don't want to be too biased and only show one side and not the other. But Catherine Mayo's book, which I've referenced, was called That Damn Why, A Record of Overseas Service, because that was what soldiers often called the YMCA. And why would that be? Because for one instance, Marian Baldwin, whose average day we took a look at, writes, "General Pershing isn't granting any leaves to the big cities. They want all the girls they can get to cheer up the boys and make up to them for not getting to go to Paris. I do think we have our work cut out for us, as they will be disappointed when they find they can't go where they like." So they tried to have a lot of different leave areas with different fun activities, but occasionally they didn't get to go to the big city, the bright lights, so they could be grumbling about that. They also didn't always love the policies that there might be, like that they couldn't bring their French dates to the YMCA dances. Sometimes they didn't like the Y volunteers that happened to be assigned to their hut. Maybe a speaker was a dud, didn't really have a good lecture for them. S.W. Reasoner, a Y man who ran canteens, helped medics on the front line and worked in sightseeing, writes, "Many of the soldiers over here have not use for us and never let an opportunity to knock us unmercifully go, because we do not give anything away like the Red Cross and the Knights of Columbus." So this comic here on this slide captures that some service organizations gave, chocolate and things like that away for free, while the YMCA charged. And it was actually because of a military order that YMCAs had to run as self-sustaining businesses. So they weren't trying to charge them. It was just that they needed to because of military expectations. Also, they had to run those big leave areas and those huts and canteens that they had to build. They couldn't just roll up in a car and hand out free items like the other service organizations occasionally did. So just a little defense there of the YMCA after some criticisms from the boys. All right, so Flora didn't only work in the mountains, she also worked on the coasts at the leave areas there. The first place that we're going to visit is Saint Nazaire, which was on the Atlantic coast, and that's where a lot of soldiers arrived to France. And this quick video clip that we'll watch shows an entertainer who's arrived to lead the fun. There's a boxing match, and then we'll also see a football game too. So we have, once it loads, an entertainer at a big boxing ring. You'll notice that these are Black troops, and the military was segregated at that time. At Saint Nazaire, there were around 7,000 Black troops permanently stationed as stevedores. So that's why they would be, here at Saint Nazaire. So we have the boxing match that the Y would probably set up. And then let's see if I can find the football match. Yeah, so some football games too. So the athletics also kept the boys busy, along with entertainment like songs, dance, and then those treats like donuts and sandwiches. So we have Saint Nazaire, and then we also have Saint Malo, which was, let's see, on the north in Brittany near the English Channel. At this leave area, Flora Mason worked, and she would probably have been doing things by sea, leading them on walks, leading them on sightseeing trips. So in this clip, we're gonna take a look at some YMCA women talking with soldiers by the seaside, guiding them on maybe some shopping excursions to find souvenirs for their folks at home. You'll notice too that there's like one YMCA woman leading dozens and dozens of soldiers. And this is kind of a running theme in stories that there's Miss Penny from Buffalo, who had 2 columns of soldiers behind her on a hike, and they followed her like happy lambs. Or there was Mary Early Holiday, who wrote in her memoir that one day she was had so many soldiers behind her trying to sightsee that she was ordering them up to the steeple of this cathedral and down to the crypt to see the mural, and they called it Miss Holiday's Regiment. So we'll take a look at what they would be doing and seeing in St. Malo on the coast. Nice beach day. A little shopping. The Y woman's up front with her scarf and all the soldiers around her. Little shopping. And then by the sea, so the Ymca Volunteer and 2 soldiers talking, catching up. The YMCA headquarters probably, so all the guys pouring out ready for their next trip or their next sightseeing expedition. Lots of grand locations too, so very different from the no man's land or the trench that they might have just come from. And then we have another YMCA woman up front in a darker dress with her YMCA armband and beret. So not a bad place to vacation for a week, especially before heading back to the trench for the fighting. So she worked at St. Malo. And lastly, Flora mentions that she worked at Cannes. And sometimes these leave areas offered quite luxurious accommodations. So as you can see, we've got some palatial buildings, palm trees. This is near Italy, so Mediterranean. So Mayo writes, fancy the romance to a lad never before out of Arkansas or rural Ohio, or who has just come from no man's land to be in this kind of space. Mayo also writes about the different activities that the soldiers that Flora would have been working with would have been getting up to. So they could fish, they could sail, they could photograph themselves. So there were vest pocket Kodaks at this time, so they could have some personal photos. There were Roman ruins. They could get on a car and go with a big bunch of soldiers for sightseeing. So lots of fun that they could get into. And again, just to draw that contrast from no man's land on the left to Cannes with the beautiful old buildings, palm trees, American women probably around it. They might not have seen or heard from somebody who could speak American English and an accent familiar to them, a pretty face in a long time. So a nice break for them. So as you can see, so to kind of sum up, Flora was stationed at a lot of different spaces. She really crisscrossed France. And transfers weren't uncommon. So lest you think that she wasn't a good volunteer and they kept booting her to other leave areas, transfers helped to avoid burnout. So Marian Baldwin writes that, they might go out into the field and then come back and work a leave area. Just to keep them fighting fit. After working at La Bourboulay, Mont d'Or, Saint-Nazaire, Saint-Malo, and Cannes, after the armistice was figured out in November 1918 and troops began being sent home in 1919, Flora Mason also headed home. So we have the ship, the passenger list from the ship when it arrived back in America in July 1919. It's an interesting note that the ship was the SS Prince Friedrich Wilhelm. So it was a German liner that the US Navy used after the war to transport troops home. We can see that she's headed back to Marietta, Ohio. So what happened next for Flora? We do have some records to let us know what her life was like after the war. She returned to Marietta in 1919. In January 1920, she's still listed 2nd Street, Marietta, Ohio. But then a couple weeks later, she's married. So wedding bells in January of 1920. And this record from Family Search lets us know that she got married to Dr. James Hamilton Jr., who was a physician from Rhode Island who also served in the medical corps during the First World War. So there are no records that placed Flora in Rhode Island before this, and no records that placed James in Ohio, as far as I could find. So probably they met at some point during their service, whether that was in New York or on the ship tour from France, or maybe, when they're at a leave area and he is hoping for a dance with a particular leave worker. And so, well, I mentioned that YMCA women weren't supposed to become the sweethearts of the soldiers, just remind them of their sweethearts at home. That doesn't mean that it didn't happen. So another just fun side note, this is a picture from the Signal Corps from 1919 in Paris, France. We have Captain W.A. Garvey of the 15th Artillery getting married to Miss Dorothy Grace Marling of the YMCA, and a ceremony being performed by one of the French mayors in Paris. So newlyweds are on the left, and then on the right, probably their witnesses, and one of them is a woman in her YMCA uniform with her YMCA hat. So it did happen, or else they had a very whirlwind 6-month romance before getting married. So after getting married, she moved to Rhode Island, and she is still having her musical career even after getting married and moving. We see her again in the musical Blue Book of America in 1921 to 22. She's listed as Mrs. Flora Mason Hamilton, organist, pianist, teacher, and accompanist. So still hard at work in her musical career. So as we wrap up our story with Flora, we'll wrap up with the YMCA too. So what about the Y? Was that wartime service just kind of a fluke, like, oh, during World War I, we're gonna, go overseas and have all of this intense welfare work going on? Actually, no. So during the First World War, there were a lot of different service organizations that were working with soldiers. So they were all separate, independent. We had the YMCA, the Knights of Columbus, the Jewish Welfare Board, Salvation Army, Young Women's Christian Association, American Library Association, and the War Camp Community Service. So lots of different organizations working. And then they had a united fundraising campaign, and that united idea stuck around. So during the Second World War, they joined forces and created the United Service Organizations, or the USO. So that's still with us today. So as we close, just a reflection on why we should remember the YMCA, why we should remember Flora Mason and her work during the First World War. So I think that we can make a pretty easy connection to today, actually, to our lives today, that we know after the last year and a half that living in historic, unprecedented times is very hard. It's very exhausting. And during this pandemic, we've coped by watching movies and TV shows. We've made warm beverages and baked sourdough bread. We've had cell phone calls and Zoom calls with family and friends who can't be with us in person. We've written snail mail letters, and we've listened to music that reminds us of days past, maybe simpler times. And that's just what they did 100 years ago, only they didn't have laptops and cell phones. They had the YMCA to help get them through the war to end all wars and their own pandemic. So the YMCA was the soldiers' collection of music and movies. They brought film reels, they brought record players, they brought entertainers and vaudeville actors. The YMCA was the soldiers' chance to phone home. They had stationery and letters, and then they stood in for mom and dad and brother and sister when they couldn't be with their folks in person. And the YMCA was the soldiers' kitchen with hot chocolate and cookies, and it was their family room with fireplaces and books and magazines and quiet conversation about anything but the war. So when we think about history, we often think about the big picture, but that can be exhausting and overwhelming. And the small, the little personal things are part of history too, and very powerful. So, you know, these are the things that get us through so that we can do what we need to do, whether that's fighting a war, whether that's fighting a pandemic. So I want to thank you all for being here online and in person, and thank the Castle for having me and letting me geek out about my favorite period in history and a favorite part of that period of history. And I'm happy to take questions if you have any.
Okay, so we'll just take questions now from our in-person and our virtual audience. I'm going to stop the share real quick. Okay. So for those that are online, if you will put your questions into the Q&A, that would be the most convenient for us, or putting it in the chat, we can check that as well. But we'll go ahead and start with Claire's going to call on you whenever you have a question, and then she'll be checking the online questions as well.
All right. Yes, of course.
Something really confuses me.
Sure.
When I was in high school here in Marietta, we had YMCA, which stood for Young Men's Christian Association.
Yes.
We had what we called YTs, which is Young Women's Christian Organization, which met after Betsy Nichols. But it's interesting to me that the YMCA sponsored an organization for women.
Right. Yeah. So the question for those online who might not have heard is just a note that it's maybe confusing or intriguing that the YMCA was sponsoring this welfare work from women too. Yeah, they did have YWCA, so Young Women's Christian Association, helping out. They also sent volunteers overseas too, but not as many. But they often worked for like women war workers, so they would have hostess houses and different things to support their work going on. But yeah, it is interesting that the women were volunteering through an organization that was the Young Men's Christian Association. So yeah, I don't know if it was perhaps because they had more funding or more, you know, resources, but yeah, that was where they were finding that path overseas. So yeah, any other questions in person? Sure, yeah.
The artwork that was done under Howard Chandler Christie did a lot of the artwork. Do you know if he did any of those that were up there?
The question was artwork from the First World War being from, it was Howard Chandler Christie, and I'm not positive. That's something, they did have a lot of posters for that United War Work campaign in November 1918. Something also interesting about that is that you might think, oh, but the armistice was signed that month, so why did they need fundraising? But they still had to support the soldiers through occupying Germany and waiting to be sent home. So they were still fundraising at that time, but I'm not positive about who made those propaganda posters or those posters, but it would be something that I'd be happy to look up. Yeah, that's interesting that there's a particular artist who's very well known. So thank you. Yeah.
Do you know how often soldiers were sent for leaves?
That's a good question. So the question is how often soldiers were sent on leave, and I'm not positive. I'm thinking if there were, millions of soldiers, and within that window that I had in that source where it was 300 or so thousand soldiers, yeah, I'm not positive if it might have been, maybe every couple months, maybe every year. Because I'm not positive how many leaves the American soldiers went on since they were there for about a year. So yeah, that's a good question though. How often would they get to go have a holiday in one of these places? Yeah, other questions, anything? Yeah, Jane.
What did Flora do until she was 38?
Oh, yes. So until she was 38, I believe that in her census, her occupation was a pianist or a teacher or doing the musician work that she did. On her marriage record too, her occupation was listed as organist and pianist. So she would have been playing probably at the churches around here, doing things like that. So yeah. I do have a couple questions online that I'll get to as well. So Sarah Mullins asked, how did you first get interested in this Y research and Flora? So I first learned about women's YMCA work during the First World War when I was an undergrad student back in Indiana. I had a mentor, a professor who knew that I was interested in women's history and World War I. And she said, there's a memoir at the Indiana Historical Society by a woman who served with the YMCA overseas, Mary Early Holiday, who I mentioned. And so she was like, oh, you could do an independent research project on that. And thus I did. And it's been, how many years should I age myself since then, but many years. So I've been thrilled to continue learning more and more about the folks who went overseas and did this important work to boost morale and to lift spirits and keep us going during hard times. For Flora particularly, the castle has a night at the museum, and about 2 years ago, they asked me to be Flora Mason for that night. So I started to learn a little bit more about her then. And of course, there was more than I could say in the 5 minutes that I would have with guests then as they were going through the night at the museum. So I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to share more about her and her life. And then Kathleen Bechtel asks, what first inspired your passion about this subject, which I think I answered with the last question, that independent research project where I got to learn about Mary Early Holiday's work. Yeah, and it's been fun since then. Scott Britton mentions on here a former Marietta College science professor, James Birchby, who had moved to Los Angeles after teaching at Marietta, joined the YMCA. He was killed in the trenches of Argonne by a high explosive shell in October 1918 while tending to a wounded US Marine. He's buried in the Moose Argonne Cemetery there, like Flora, who was also 38. So that underscores that how close some of the volunteers did go to be with the soldiers in their time of need. S.W. Reasoner, who I mentioned, who talked about how soldiers sometimes criticize the Y, he went to the front lines and took care of soldiers, helped with the medics with taking care of the wounded. And in Mayo's book in the back, there's a list of those awards, so those Distinguished Service Crosses, things like that. Also a list of those who were killed, who were shell-shocked, who were gassed. So we know that that they definitely went forward. The female volunteers didn't usually get to go that close, but we did have some rebels. So Marian Baldwin, who I mentioned, snuck past the military police with 3 other YMCA volunteers, and they went to the front during a drive, an offensive drive, and they were going to be sent back, and they were like, "We can't send you back. The guys are happy that you're here." So they also sometimes got close. And then Kathleen also asks, how much does your research influence what you do as a living history performer reenactor? So I also do living history with YMCA work. So I put on the uniform, and I'm in 1917 or 1918, and I roll out Play-Doh and have the kids stamp out donuts to help me with my work. And reading the memoirs, the letters, those things have really formed my, impression when I go out and talk with folks about what's happening, what I'm up to, what I'm doing, and why I'm doing it. So there are a lot of wonderful collections of letters and memoirs and journal entries from YMCA volunteers that give me that background, so I can speak, from their experiences. So I think that was all the questions. And oh, nope. One more. So, do you go to schools and present to history classes? I do not, although I would love to. I have helped with the history camp here. So we're going to do this era next year, I think. So hopefully I'll be able to present and do my living history thing there as well. But yeah, does anyone else have any questions here? Yes. Yeah.
How old was she when she died? She had children, and where is she buried?
Oh, so she's buried in Rhode Island. I'm trying to remember how old she was. She didn't have any children, but I'm not sure about her death date. So I can look that up. But yeah, so she is buried in Rhode Island with her husband. And yeah, they continued their work well into their lives. So, any other questions? Thank you. Yes.
I was wondering, in World War II, I mean, of course, the war was all over Europe.
Yes.
Were they able to have any kind of locations then?
That's a good question. So the question was if during World War II they had leave areas like this, and I'm not positive. Hopefully they would have, especially since, again, the soldiers wouldn't be able to go home as easily, if they're fighting in Europe or in Asia, the Pacific. So I'm not positive, though. I'll have to look that up because I know the USO was there with them, but I'm not sure if they ran leave areas like this. So yeah. All right, let's see, let me check. I don't have any other questions online. Any others here? Well, thank you all again, and thank you to the castle for letting me.
Thank you all, and thank you all online as well. This is going to conclude our presentation. Please go onto our website, mariattacastle.org, to learn more about the events that we have coming up, which is quite a few in the next couple weeks or so. So please take a look at that. And also, this will be available via YouTube, via the Castle's YouTube page. So if you miss a portion of it or just want to go back and relive it, please feel free. Okay, thank you all. Now I'll go ahead and end the presentation for our guest online. So thank you very much for attending. Bye-bye.